Hello and welcome. My name is Sharon Hammer, and I'm here with my friend and colleague Lisa Ladson, and we are going to talk to you today about autism. This training is really considered an introduction to autism, and so what we're going to be going over today is some of the basics. So if you are someone who is new to the autism diagnosis or new to the autism community, this session will be the right session for you. As I said, my name is Sharon, and I am a licensed professional counselor. I've been working with people with autism for over 20 years, and I work at Imagine a Child's Capacity with Lisa.
Yeah, and my name, like Sharon said, is Lisa Ladson, and I too have been working a little bit longer than Sharon has with individuals with autism, and also work at Imagine a Child's Capacity. We're based out of Madison, Wisconsin. So we'll jump right into it. So we wanted to start just kind of with a little information of what we know about autism. We know that autism is a neurodevelopmental disability. Oftentimes we hear that people categorize autism more behaviorally, and what we really know is that it's a brain-based disability. It's not a mental illness. It's not the same as a cognitive disability. In fact, kind of research really supports that possibly up to 2/3 of individuals with autism have average or above average intelligence, and it may be more. And we really like to stress that autism isn't a cognitive disability. And so we like to think of it more as access, that what an individual can access at any given time with lots of different things that may interfere, and we'll talk about those in a minute. But that's really the crust of it. It's, brain-based. And so information comes in, it might get on a different track. It, kind of some individuals might have difficulty with output, but not a mental illness and not the same as a cognitive disability. It's not to say that individuals with autism cannot have comorbid conditions, such as anxiety or depression, those types of things, but kind of the core, it's a neurodevelopmental disability. It's our strong bias that you cannot cure autism, and nor should we try. And we say that because knowing autism is a brain-based, unless, we figure out how to change the brain, it's kind of we're looking at the core. We don't want to change who the individual is. This is just a piece of kind of that overall picture.
And many adults with autism, if you talk to them and you say, if you were offered a choice of, say, not having autism tomorrow, if I could give you a magic pill and you would wake up tomorrow not having autism, the vast majority of adults with autism will say they would not take that pill. They really are happy with who they are, and the gifts and challenges that autism brings to their lives are things that they embrace as part of themselves. Yeah. And so part of our bias and why we have that last point on this slide is when we talk about curing autism, which you might hear some providers talk about, that really does not sit very well for a lot of individuals that have autism, because it's talking about almost taking away part of who they are or their identity. So we like to add that just to our slides, that maybe we should not be thinking about curing autism. Maybe instead, when we think about supporting people with autism, we should look at things they're interested in working on and things they're interested in changing.
Yeah. We also know that there is a lot of research being done around kind of autism, and we really know that it affects multiple areas of the brain. And kind of the most known areas are kind of how it affects overall social and communication pieces for individuals with autism. But we also know that it affects multiple areas of the brain, and we're getting more and more information about how it affects movement, how it affects just different areas, and how the brain processes and uses information. We know that it's a whole body disorder rather than just a brain disorder. We know it's brain-based, but it affects kind of the whole body. And Martha Leary has done some extensive research, and if you Google her, she has a couple of really great books, along with Ann Donnellan, around the movement perspective with autism.
So the other piece that we absolutely do know about autism is that it affects people from all ethnic and socioeconomic backgrounds. So in this way, autism does not discriminate. It does not target a specific type of population. The only type of population or subset of the population that we do know autism affects differently is the ratio of boys to girls or men to women. And so that ratio is, it affects 4 males to every 1 female. And I do want to make a note about even that statistic. There is some new research coming out that even says we might be underdiagnosing girls or missing some women that are in fact on the autism spectrum, and that this 4-to-1 ratio that has been in place for a long time might actually not be accurate, because we are misidentifying or missing a lot of women and girls that are on the autism spectrum.
Yeah.
The latest rates that came to us from the CDC, and this is very recent, this came out, I believe, in March of this year, is autism is being diagnosed at a rate of 1 in 54 children. And this is a rate that we have seen greatly increase over the last 10, 20 years. We keep seeing it kind of going up, and there are a few reasons about that we'll talk about in a moment.
When we think about autism, we really there's some main areas that we are going to talk about and take into consideration. And probably one of the most prevalent where we're going to start is talking about the sensory system and how it affects individuals with autism. Then we're going to move into communication and how communication is affected, a little bit about cognition. We're going to touch on kind of social emotional needs, and then end with some movement. So we will get started with sensory regulation. As the slide states, the nervous system's ability to perceive and integrate sensory input and then attain, maintain, and or change levels of arousal or alertness. That's what sensory regulation is. And there are some key pieces kind of in that when we talk about the nervous system's ability to perceive and integrate input. Kind of how information's coming in, how the body is taking that information, where it's, kind of moving throughout the body, what cues it gives, what information is stored. But that's when we talk about a whole body disorder, the sensory system kind of is a main indicator there.
We have a quote here from an individual that has autism. And Lisa and I often like to make the point that while neither one of us is on the autism spectrum, we have learned more from people on autism talking about their autism than we have from any professionals in the field. And so throughout our presentation, what we really try to do is to give a voice to people that are on the spectrum themselves. And so here's one of our examples of that, and this is a quote from Darren White. I will read it to you. I was rarely able to hear sentences because my hearing distorted them. I was sometimes able to hear a word or two at the start and understand it. And then the next lot of words sort of merged into one another, and I could not make head or tail of it. So for those of us that are old enough or enjoyed Charlie Brown as a kid, we often think about it like the Charlie Brown teacher, who maybe you could hear the beginning of her sentences, but then at the end it just kind of goes to the words don't become clear. That's what Darren is describing here. And many of the things we're going to talk about with sensory are not specific to everyone with autism. And so autism being a spectrum, which is really important note to make, everybody experiences autism differently. And so when we spend some time now talking about sensory considerations, I'm going to give you examples throughout, and they may or may not apply to the person you know. And so it's all, people with autism are as individual as human beings that don't have autism. And so everything we're talking about may apply, may not apply. The other thing that happens a lot, especially in sensory processing, is that it's dynamic and that it can change over time. So somebody that may be highly sensitive to sound one moment or one day, the next day may not, or the next moment their sensory system may have shifted and they may not be so sensitive. So it's just something to be aware of, especially as we get into the sensory components. So the first point on this slide is just that people with autism may have differences in processing sensory input. We know this for sure. In fact, most recently in the DSM, which is the diagnostic manual that many people with autism get diagnosed using, they have added sensory processing differences as a possible criteria to identify autism. So adults with autism have been telling us this for a long time, and finally I think we're catching up. Professionals are catching up, and they're recognizing that sensory processing differences are a real piece to autism. The next consideration on this slide is just that people with autism may have differences in maintaining their levels of arousal. So what this kind of means is that for those of us not on the autism spectrum, sometimes we're able to match our activity level to the activity or the environment, and we're able to do it naturally. And so when I walk in to a quiet library and I notice all the social cues in front of me, like everybody sitting and reading quietly, I also notice the environment, that there's a really low level of noise in the environment. I am able to adapt my arousal and my regulation level to match. And that is where that can be tricky for some of our friends that have autism, that they may have trouble both with the social aspects of it, of picking up on those social cues, but then also if I just came in from outside and I was running around and now you expect me to go in a library and be quiet, it might actually take me longer to adjust my activity level to match the situation that's happening.
Yeah. The next one is that some individuals may have differences in modulation. And so, like Sharon was saying, individuals without autism oftentimes have an easier sense of being able to, wake up in the morning. You may be kind of under aroused. You're just waking up quietly and you go into the shower, turn the shower on, and your alertness jumps right up. And then you're more awake and you get out of the shower, you get dressed, you go into the kitchen, you might have a cup of coffee, which further kind of, gets your level of arousal and your kind of ability to modulate, and you're on. And kind of throughout the day, as there are highs and lows in kind of our overall level of alertness or, kind of that matching, we may get tired, we may, but we kind of stay in a middle ground where we're pretty available for what's going on in our environment. And sometimes, and we switch pretty easily. And that can be something that can be challenging, kind of some of our individual friends with autism may stay at a lower level of arousal. Some, kind of are way up high. June Groden did research many years ago on kind of heart rate in individuals with autism, and we know from her research that at rest, individuals with autism, their heart rate is 20 beats per minute faster. And so they start out in a higher kind of level of arousal. We think that there might be some correlation in some difficulties with sleeping, some difficulties in being able to, calm the body. And so those kind of the sensory system impacts all of those things. We also know that many may experience a buildup of sensory insults throughout the day. And so, oftentimes Sharon and I do a lot of work in schools, supporting schools. And oftentimes we'll hear kind of one or the other, where students do really great. They don't see a lot of kind of sensory related needs at school, we'll often hear. And so they push through the day, and then when they get home, it's like they bottom out, and the parents will say, oh my gosh, when he gets home, he just completely falls apart. And so, kind of that the amount of energy that oftentimes it could be a delay of processing kind of sensory insults. And, kind of right now we know with the COVID-19, all of our at least our younger children are at home. Many of us are. We live in Wisconsin, and we have a safer at home stay. So most of us are at home. But, kind of when our kids are in school, there's fluorescent lights. There's, maybe 300, 400, 500 kids in the building. There's lots of different sounds and movements and, different things that can impact. And some kids may be able to process those in real time. Some of it may be delayed. And if it's delayed, it may build up across the day, and then you see some bottoming out at home. So, kind of this area of sensory regulation is really key kind of in understanding and helping support individuals.
And when we're talking about sensory processing, so we are talking about the 5 systems that you know about, that you learn about in kindergarten. You learn about sight, sense of sight, your sense of taste, your sense of touch, your auditory sense or your sense of hearing, and your sense of smell. There's also 3 more senses that sometimes are called the hidden senses because they're not the ones that we hear about the most. They're not the ones that we talk about the most. But when it comes to sensory processing and sensory processing differences, they're really important that we know about them. And so those 3 hidden senses, the first one we're going to talk briefly about just to make sure everybody understands at least a little bit is proprioception. Your sense of proprioception exists throughout your whole body, and it exists mostly in your muscles and your joints. And it is your sensation that lets you know where your body is at in space. So it's a sensation that allows you to, if you want to do this at home, you can, close your eyes and extend a pointer finger out and bring your pointer finger to your nose without opening your eyes. You can do that thanks to your sense of proprioception. You know where your nose is without looking at it. You know where the tip of your finger is without having to see it. You can do that because your senses are giving you accurate information about where your body is at. The next hidden sense is vestibular. And your sense of vestibular mostly lives in your inner ear. And some people call this your sense of balance. You could also think about it like your sense of processing movement through space. It's your sense that allows you to, if you're leaning, if you want to practice this one at home or try this one on at home, If you lean as far as you can one way in your chair, either to the left or to the right, and you can do that, and you can hold it without falling out of your chair, you can thank your vestibular sense. It's letting you know where your body is at when it's moving. And then the last hidden sense is your sense of interoception. And I have to say that if you want to learn more about this, Kelly Mahler's session during this training, she's going to have a keynote session on interoception and teaching about interoception. But if you want the basics, what interoception is it's the senses that you get from the inside of your body. And so it is senses that you get from your internal organs, like your stomach and like your bladder. It also is the sensations that you process when you're feeling emotions. So any basically of those sensations that come from inside of your body are considered interoception. So those are those three hidden senses that we don't know so much about. We're going to talk about why they're important on the next slide.
Let's see. Oh, whoops. So when we think about possible sensory processing differences, when we were talking before about modulation and levels of arousal, some individuals may have a sense of over-registration. So they may, just a normal talking voice may be amplified so that it sounds like someone is shouting. It may be that someone does a light tap on their shoulder to get their attention and it feels like a punch in their body. So that can be an over-registration. And that's how their body is really processing that information, that hyper-responsive. Under-registration, I have had individuals that I have known that have broken a bone or have, a burn and not registered it as pain. So there's different, kind of levels of under-registration, again, affecting all of those areas that we were talking about before. It could be sound, it could be taste, it could be smells, kind of all of those issues. We see an over and under registration can be a possible difference. We talked quite extensively before about modulation issues, but I wanted to, monochannel is the next one on the slide, and that is kind of described as when a person is in monochannel, they're only processing one kind of sense at a time. And so oftentimes what we'll see, I'll give you an example in a classroom. Sometimes students put their heads down on the table so that they can hear what the teacher is saying. And oftentimes, we'll say, put your head up, pay attention, when in fact, kind of their system has gone into monochannel. So if they're going to hear you, they can't look at you. They can only kind of engage one of those sensory modalities at a time. So that we often see. And kids oftentimes will get really frustrated, and or adults on, kind of they're trying the best they can working with their internal system. And, we hear kids saying they're getting in trouble for it. So they're just trying to compensate. Oftentimes, too, we'll see differences in integration and organization. Integration, kind of how input is coming in. Sometimes we'll hear it being described as all information comes in equally. And so, Sharon and I are sitting in an office right now, and we can hear the heating system. There are fluorescent lights. There are cars driving by kind of outside. And our brain, our bodies naturally kind of integrate that information. But the most kind of salient is that I'm listening to Sharon when she talks and she's listening to me. And oftentimes kind of the most salient thing, kind of the speaker, isn't what's integrated with the most accuracy. So the sound of the heater may be more amplified than anything else in the room for an individual with autism. And that also can affect organization, just kind of where that information is stored, kind of knowing what to do to make, kind of to be available for the most salient thing. Those areas we see some processing differences. The last one is a sensory discrimination issue. And so that is described kind of to us as, kind of for most of us, we're, kind of what we're hearing, what we're seeing, what we're smelling, it's very distinct. What we're tasting, and there can be some discrimination differences for individuals where how they process information, kind of that. And there's something called synesthesia that some individuals with autism have talked about, and kind of they process emotions by seeing colors, or kind of hearing glass, kind of being tapped makes their teeth hurt. So it's kind of a where you think that they would be processing that kind of sound would be through the ears and make their ears hurt, in fact makes kind of a different, they're experiencing it in a different way.
I think the most important point to make on any of these slides about sensory is that so many times we see autistic individuals displaying behaviors that we might not understand. And, sometimes I think you think of classic, like Rain Man or something like that, where you have somebody who might be flapping their hands, or you have somebody who might be rocking in a chair. And what we now understand about the sensory processing differences is that many of those behaviors that autistic people engage in are often doing something to help them regulate their body. Mm-hmm. They are often doing something that is helping them maintain focus, or helping them to tune out other input. Oftentimes there is some reason. There is always a reason why they are engaging in those behaviors. And so it's just something that we like to think about, because a lot of times, this goes back to our statement way at the beginning about it's our bias that we are not trying to cure autism. If you have somebody who is flapping their hands because it is a way for them to regulate their body and maybe tune out some input that actually feels painful to them, I don't think it's part of our job to stop them from flapping their hands unless it's something that they themselves want to do. So unless it's something that is bothering them because of a social reason or an emotional reason. If they have a reason to change that behavior, we can support them on changing it and maybe finding something else for them to do. But if they don't, I think, again, it's our bias that maybe the world should change to just be more accepting of behaviors like that, and really come at it from the understanding that that person is doing that behavior for a reason. It is doing something in their body.
Mm-hmm. So now we're going to transition on to communication. And we're going to talk about a couple of different areas, both expressive language and receptive language. There's so many different ways that we can communicate, and, not also just through formal language. So we're going to hear from Jim Sinclair, who talks in starting out our section on communication. And he says, "I simply didn't know what talking was for. Speech therapy was just a lot of meaningless drills in repeating meaningless sounds for incomprehensible reasons. I had no idea that this could be a way to exchange meaning with other minds." And I think that is so important, often when we think about the diagnosis of autism, communication is one of those areas historically that's been a main focus. Oftentimes we'll see a delay in the acquisition of expressive communication. And, for many individuals that Sharon and I support, we know some individuals that don't have expressive communication. They have, kind of a focus on different modalities. And so when we talk about expressive communication too, we're not just talking about verbal language. There's different modalities in which, through augmentative devices, through different systems that we now have. But we know for communication that there's a continuum of access. And oftentimes, Sharon and I, in conversations with some, children and some adults who talk about communication, oftentimes verbal language is not their preferred mode of communication. And I think, it has to go back with processing kind of that, they find written language, kind of visual modalities, to be primary in means of communication. I think there's been lots of challenges with virtual learning, with having technology, but one of the gifts, I think, kind of on Facebook or through text or through kind of those, has really allowed for individuals to have time to process, to see the written words, and it's really enhanced communication. Many individuals may have very individualized means of communication. So what we were talking about before, a talker, different apps on an iPad, different it just means it doesn't, writing back and forth, typing back and forth. It's not all verbal. And we know that even highly verbal individuals with autism may lose their access to words, especially when emotions get heightened. And so we have to think about, just because you may have a child with autism, or you have a friend or a colleague that is highly verbal, that may not always be reliable. And so kind of backup systems are a good idea. We see some individuals that have a processing delay, and so that can really affect their communication. And oftentimes then, they can have trouble formulating a response. We oftentimes don't wait long enough. There's been research with neurotypical individuals when they ask a question or with a communication partner. The average response time is that people are comfortable with is 1 to 2 seconds. And so if you have a partner that just is taking longer to process that information, oftentimes we come back with restating it in a different way, getting louder, getting closer, where we just need to be quiet and kind of give that time so that they can be able to formulate a response.
The next area we're really going to take a close look at is cognition and learning. And when we're talking about this, it does affect all of the things that are on your screen right now. Curriculum, environment, response format, instructional style, and learning styles. We have a quote on the next slide that comes to us from Sean Barron. I will read it. He said, "I loved repetition. Every time I turned on a light, I knew what would happen. When I flipped the switch, the light went on. It gave me a wonderful feeling of security because it was exactly the same each time." So some of the considerations for cognition and learning that we want to consider when we're learning about people that have autism or on the autism spectrum. Lisa already mentioned the delayed information processing that both kind of falls under the language area of autism and also cognition. And so when we have somebody who has that processing delay that Lisa was talking about, that also can make it look like they have a cognitive delay when in fact they may not at all have that. It really just might come down to a processing delay and those words coming in their head, and they need just time to process it. But what does end up happening is that a lot of folks on the spectrum have trouble processing rapid changes or shifting gears really quickly. And what that can end up looking like is it can end up looking like they seem less flexible. So they seem less able to handle the changes that happen quickly. One of the first things we wanted to talk about with cognition and learning was that the majority of people that have autism report thinking in pictures. Temple Grandin was the first person to talk about this many years ago. And this will date this quote, but when Temple Grandin first talked about it, she talked about her brain working like a VCR. More recent quotes, Temple talks about her brain working like Google for images. And the reason that's different than those of us who have neurology that's in the majority is that what happens for Temple is if she hears the word cat, for an example, in her brain, she pulls up pictures of every cat that she's ever seen, known, heard about, read about, dreamed about. It pulls up this card catalog, basically, of all her pictures of cats. Now, I'm a person that doesn't have autism, and so for me, when I hear the word cat, I more think in the concept of a cat. I more get a concept of a furry animal that has pointed ears and whiskers. I don't necessarily pull up every single picture of every cat that I've ever thought of in my brain. So that's what it's like to think in pictures. And so if we go back to that processing delay that both Lisa and I were talking about earlier, we think that this may be why. If your brain works in such a way that you need to pull up a picture for every word that is said, that could cause a delay automatically. And then what happens if I use a word verbally that you don't necessarily have a picture for yet in your head? That could cause you to get stuck. And so we really think that this thinking in pictures has a big effect on cognition, what's seemingly cognition or learning for people with autism. Another thing that we wanted to highlight is just that many of us that don't have autism, we can imitate things pretty automatically. And so we can see something done and we can do it, reproduce it ourselves without giving it too much thought. And for some people with autism, that automatic imitation can be difficult to access. So they don't have an automatic way to maybe copy what somebody else is doing. Two more pieces. So one of them is that neurology just doesn't always allow for automatic integration of information. And generalizing learned skills can be complicated. And so what that means is that for those of us who are in the neuromajority, when we get information into our brain, it automatically goes to different areas in our brain and makes the connections without us even thinking about it. It just happens. Adults with autism tell us that that is not necessarily what happens for them. So what might happen for them is that they get a new piece of information, they learn something new, and they have to give conscious thought to where to kind of file that in their brain or where to put it, what categories it falls under. They have to think about that. So that's a big difference. And again, thinking about this possible processing delay, if you are taking in new information and you have to think about where that information is getting filed in your brain, that could look like a cognitive delay when in fact it's just about processing and it's about the way that your brain is taking in information. And the last point on this slide just speaks to that as well. And so we like to say that sometimes attention is dispersed differently. So we know for a fact that many people that have autism have the ability to be very attentive to details, very attentive to different things in their environment. So what we used to think of as possibly attention difficulties, we now think of a little bit differently. We now think about it as just attention being dispersed, maybe in a way that it is not for those of us that are in the neuromajority.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think we made most of these
Yep.
points already.
Yep.
Okay.
So now we're going to move into kind of the social emotional area, which is the ability to recognize and respond to emotions in ourselves and others in a predictable and conventional manner, so that we, kind of recognize someone who's happy. We kind of oftentimes when we see someone who's happy, we get that same sensation in ourselves. But we know that some individuals with autism can have a harder time being able to recognize and kind of process that information. So Temple gives us a quote, and she says, "When I encounter a new social situation, I have to scan my memory and look for previous experiences that were similar. As I accumulate more memories, I become more and more skilled at predicting how other people will act in a particular situation." And so, like Sharon was talking, for those of us in the what classified as the neuromajority, a lot of that happens very fluidly. We don't have to do kind of that same scanning of memories and really, focusing on those different social pieces. So some considerations kind of when we think about emotional regulation. Some individuals may have difficulty perceiving shades of gray. We often, kind of that black and white. And it's the more and more, I think, that individuals have experiences, we build in kind of that the gradation of how we perceive emotion. We also know that some individuals have the same emotional reaction to different size events. So some may process frustration the same kind of emotional response to breaking the tip of their pencil, to some really big losing their phone, or kind of those type of situations where you would anticipate a much larger response to losing or breaking your phone, to breaking a tip of a pencil. And so sometimes that can get really tricky. Our friend and colleague Judy Endo, kind of the world people classification, she uses that, and we love kind of that discrimination. But world people might not always communicate what they are really feeling. So if if Judy is saying, "Well, Lisa, how are you?" and I saying, "I'm fine," but kind of all of my other actions, don't kind of also play that out, it can be really confusing when there's not a match, kind of from an emotional perspective. We talked about synesthesia before, but some individuals have different ways of perceiving emotions. It can be through colors, through numbers, through different sensations. Some also need to have a physical action accompanying an emotion. So that can be, just a consideration, kind of that physical piece of that. Some individuals may actually be oversensitive to emotions, that they really feel. I'm trying to think of the gentleman who I had heard speak once, and he talked about emotions being a wave that, kind of overcame his overall body, that, he felt them so strongly. Jerry Newport. And, kind of when we think about anxiety, trauma, depression, and other co-occurring mental health issues, these can also make that emotional experience unpredictable and difficult to regulate, kind of some of those comorbid conditions that we were talking about. And it can, all of these can play a major part in some of when we're thinking about kind of how we process emotions and support individuals.
The last area we're going to give some attention to today is the area of movement differences. When we talk about movement differences, we are talking about differences in not just physical movement, the movement of your body from one place to another in space. We're also talking about movement of thoughts in your brain, or movement of words from your brain to out your mouth. We are talking about all sorts of different movement that takes place in your body. And what research is finding is that for people with autism, these differences in movement, so possible differences in starting movement, stopping movement, changing movement, is really, really tricky and for some, and can have effects on all of the different things listed here. Things like postures, actions, speech, thoughts, perceptions, emotions, and memories. That those movement differences can have lots of effects. Mm-hmm. Lisa was already thinking of this quote a slide back from Jerry Newport, and I'll read it here. I felt like the world was an ocean, and I would never knew which wave was going to knock me over next. Mm-hmm. This can be especially true in the area of movement for some of our folks that have autism. If people with autism have trouble starting, what that can look like is they may have trouble moving from place to place. They may need, I know one individual that has trouble with transitions and starting something new. And so what he actually does is he paces for a while to get himself regulated before he can start a new activity. So that's what it may look like if you're having trouble starting something. They may have trouble moving from place to place. They may need prompts or cues to start. And they may experience freezing of thought or of movement. For people who have trouble with differences in stopping, this may look like some repetitive behaviors we see. So this could look like some of the rocking back and forth, some of the flapping maybe. Sometimes people who have trouble stopping may seem impulsive. They might ask the same questions over and over. They might we read a quote earlier about flicking a light switch off and on. And what we need to know about this is that if you're physically having trouble stopping something, it could be a thought. If you're physically having trouble stopping a thought in your head, the majority of the time this is not something that is in the control of the person that has autism. Our absolute bias is that the majority of the time people with autism are doing the very best that they can, given everything we've just already talked to you about today, and movement is a big consideration, a big thing to consider when we're talking about that.
We also, when we're thinking about movement, those that have differences in continuing, sometimes we see, like it says, staying seated or in one place, jump around, topic switch a lot, jump around in conversations, difficulty staying on task. We see those types of things. And that kind of leads also into switching, the differences in switching, kind of when they change place to place or person to person, activity to activity. That often requires, our being able to shift our thinking and actions and our emotions, and kind of, we've talked a lot about kind of the sensory impacts, the communication impacts, and all of these. When we initially talked about autism being a whole body, affecting the whole body, these are the areas that we're really talking about, kind of that ability and movement plays a part in all of that. So kind of those are the main areas that we wanted to give an overview and highlight on. And initially, kind of earlier on, Sharon was talking a little bit about, we've seen an increase in the rates of autism. And we just wanted to take, right before we go into our 10 tips, kind of what some of those things might be. And, I often, my parents are in their late 70s, and they often would say to me, I just don't remember anybody in your class having autism. And, so oftentimes people will say, well, the number is, so much more prevalent because they just didn't diagnose it back then. And I think, that's a part of it. We've gotten better at diagnosing. We've gotten clearer at kind of some of the impacts around the sensory systems and how movement impacts, along with those social and communication factors. But that, kind of only is accounting for part of that. We are seeing kind of the rates of autism steadily increase. And there, is pretty consistent research happening about what are the factors that are influencing that. Is it environmental? Is technology playing a part in that? Is are we just that much better at at the diagnosis? And so I think there's, all of those factors are playing a part, and we are seeing more autism.
I was just talking, Lisa mentioned our friend Judy, and I was just talking to her a couple days ago about this very thing. And she said the rate that our world moves now is just so much faster, and people are expected to keep up. Mm-hmm. And that in the past, we may have not diagnosed people because they were just better at possibly blending in with the neuromajority because the speed the world moved was just slower. Mm-hmm. And now we're all so connected. I mean, even this conference, pulling this conference off, we're actually not all in the same place, but we have the technology now to make everybody together virtually in the same place to share this time. Mm-hmm. The world moves at a very, very fast rate. And so even that, mm-hmm. how fast the world moves, we're now catching people who might just need more time to process the world. Mm-hmm. So that might be part of why we're seeing those numbers go up.
Yeah. As we close our session, we just wanted to give you a couple of tips when we're supporting individuals with autism. So tip number 1, change the way you think and talk about behavior. It's not that he won't, it's that he can't. Taking into consideration, again, all of the things that we've talked about from a sensory perspective, an emotional regulation perspective, communication, really people are doing the best that they can. And so when we think that they're being manipulative or he won't do something, it really shrinks the scope of supports that we can offer. If we really understand that he's doing or she is doing the best that they can and that they can't access what they need in that moment, it really opens up the scope of supports.
Another thing that we want to make sure we're doing is just allowing for that processing time that we've been talking about. So in other words, just wait. Mm-hmm.
Use concrete and visual cues whenever possible. Visual cues are salient. They stay. They're not fleeting. And so it helps with the overall processing.
Being sensitive and aware of kinds of sensory input people seem to seek out or avoid. And then reducing sensory insults when possible. If somebody does not like fluorescent lights, it actually hurts their eyes, then is there an alternative that we can do? Making sure we allow for that.
Mm-hmm. Tip number 5, talk less, talk less, talk less. Again, with the processing differences and overall less wordy, just pause more, those types of things. Number 6, make sure the individual has a communication system, regardless of if an individual is highly verbal or is nonverbal. We want to make sure that everybody has a voice. Everybody has a means to communicate.
Tip number 7, we need to teach everybody, not just autistic individuals. We need to teach everybody skills to cope and to regulate. And what may be true for people on the spectrum is we might have to do that teaching more directly. So it might not, regulating your emotions and your emotional state just might not come as naturally for some people on the spectrum. And so we might need to do some more direct teaching of that. Tip number 8, focus on proactive and positive interventions. Again, this is our complete bias. But the more proactive interventions and supports we put in place, the more we're going to be able to support people and the less reactive we're going to have to be later.
Mm-hmm. Tip number 9 is be concrete and specific with your language. Avoid using idioms or double meanings. Our example here is, she has a chip on her shoulder. Where if someone is processing that in a very concrete manner, they may think that there are chips sitting on their shoulder, and that can be confusing. And number 10, make rules as clear, specific, and concrete as possible, and avoid changing them if you can. With all we talked about with movement, routines are so important, and it's just the more predictable we can make things, the better chance that individuals are going to be more successful.
In our next few slides, we have specific information about where to go for more information or help in Wisconsin. And I'm realizing that we may have people from Minnesota on this webcast as well. And so what I just want to say is your local autism society, whether it be of Wisconsin or Minnesota or any of the affiliates, are great places to go for more information. Most local autism societies will have a bank of resources for you to go to. A lot of local branches will also have support groups. They will have social groups. And so it's always my first go-to place to get more information. So please go there if you need more help.
Yep. Wisconsin is broken up kind of into three main areas. The Autism Society of South Central Wisconsin, the Autism Society of Southeastern Wisconsin, and then kind of the overall Society of Greater Wisconsin Service Area. So there's just a map that kind of foreshadows that information. Okay. So we thank you so much for being with us for this time, and we hope you are all safe and healthy and navigating this new world of virtual learning. I think we're all trying to figure these pieces out, but we really appreciate your time and attention. So we thank you so much. All right. Thank you.